At 14:23 on April 7, 1945, a column of fire erupted from the sea 290 kilometers southwest of Kyushu. The pillar rose 2,000 meters into the sky, forming a mushroom cloud that climbed 6,000 meters high. The thunderous explosion was heard and felt 200 kilometers away in Kagoshima. American pilots circling overhead felt the shockwave slam into their aircraft even at altitude. In the waters below, thousands of men who had been alive just seconds before were now gone, consumed by an explosion so massive it may have destroyed more American aircraft than Japanese anti-aircraft fire had during the entire battle. Observers on nearby Tokunoshima Island and the distant Kyushu coast saw the fireball rise above the horizon. The Battleship Yamato, the largest and most powerful warship ever built, named after the ancient poetic word for Japan itself, had just torn herself apart. This is the story of how the mightiest warship in history was deliberately sent on a suicide mission with no hope of success. It is the story of admirals who refused orders and then changed their minds. Of nearly 7,000 men who sailed knowing they would never return. Of a nation so committed to symbolic gesture that it sacrificed its greatest weapon for nothing more than the appearance of fighting spirit. And of the 2 hours of relentless destruction that ended the age of the battleship forever. Yamato was not merely a warship. She was the physical embodiment of Japanese imperial ambition and the absolute apex of battleship design. Her name carried profound cultural significance that went far beyond a simple ship designation. Yamato was the classical term meaning great harmony, the same word used to describe the Japanese people themselves and their unique national spirit. The concept of Yamato Damashi referred to the fighting character that Japan believed set it apart from all other nations on Earth. Naming the world's mightiest battleship after the nation itself was an act of supreme symbolic weight. This floating fortress literally embodied everything Japan believed about its own power, destiny, and place in the world. Her specifications read like a catalogue of superlatives that no other vessel could match. Her standard displacement reached 65,000 tons. At full load, she displaced nearly 73,000 tons, making her roughly 20,000 tons heavier than any American battleship ever constructed. Her overall length measured 263 meters, stretching longer than 3 football fields placed end to end. Her beam extended nearly 39 meters. At full load, she drew almost 11 meters of water, requiring specially dredged channels at many Japanese ports just to accommodate her massive hull. The armor protecting this Leviathan was the thickest ever placed on any warship in history. Her main belt consisted of steel plates, 410 millimeters thick, angled outward at 20 degrees from vertical to improve deflection against incoming shells. The armored deck ranged from 200 to 230 millimeters. The turret faces were an extraordinary 650 millimeters of hardened steel, more than 2 feet thick, capable of withstanding direct hits from the largest naval guns in existence. The barbets, protecting the turret machinery, measured 560 millimeters. The conning tower sides reached 500 millimeters. Approximately 1/3 of her entire displacement consisted of armor plate alone. But it was her main armament that truly set Yamato apart from every other warship ever built. She carried 9 46-centimeter guns, officially designated as 18.1-inch weapons, arranged in 3 massive triple turrets. 2 turrets were mounted forward of the superstructure and 1 aft. These were the largest naval guns ever mounted on a warship. Each gun weighed over 164,000 kilograms. Each barrel stretched over 21 meters long. These weapons could fire an armor-piercing shell weighing 1,460 kilograms, more than 3,200 pounds, to a maximum range of 42 kilometers at 45 degrees elevation. Each complete turret, with all its mechanisms, training gear, and ammunition handling equipment, weighed approximately 2,774 metric tons, heavier than many destroyers. The weapons were so secret that Japan went to extraordinary lengths to conceal their true size from the entire world. Even Germany's naval attaché was told they were merely 40-centimeter guns. Official documents referred to them by a deliberately false designation. Allied intelligence did not confirm the true caliber until after the war ended. The Japanese government feared that if America learned the actual size, American shipyards would simply build even larger guns and negate the advantage Japan had worked so hard to achieve. Yamato was built at Kure Naval Arsenal in Hiroshima Prefecture under extraordinary secrecy that remains remarkable even by wartime standards. A massive canopy made of palm fronds and hemp rope covered the entire dry dock to hide the hull from aerial observation. Fishing nets and camouflage netting obscured all activities from nearby hills. Workers underwent rigorous background vetting before being allowed anywhere near the construction site. Police monitored the homes of anyone involved. Workers could not discuss their jobs with family members, under penalty of severe punishment. The entire surrounding area was declared a restricted military zone. The keel was laid on November 4, 1937. Construction proceeded rapidly, despite the unprecedented engineering challenges of building the largest warship in history. The hull required specially manufactured steel plates thicker than any previously produced by Japanese industry. New cranes had to be built just to lift the armor sections into place. The main gun turrets were so massive that each required its own dedicated assembly process, taking months to complete. She was launched without ceremony on August 8, 1940, sliding into the water while no cameras recorded the event. Final fitting out continued through the following year, as thousands of workers installed the complex systems that would make her operational. She was commissioned on December 16, 1941, just 9 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor that brought America into the war. The timing was coincidental but symbolic. Japan's mightiest weapon entered service just as Japan began a war it could not win. The total cost of construction reached approximately 250 million yen, equivalent to roughly $2.5 billion in modern terms. This represented the most expensive single-weapon system Japan had ever built. The resources consumed by Yamato and her sisters could have constructed dozens of submarines or hundreds of aircraft. Many Japanese officers later questioned whether those resources might have been better spent on weapons more suited to the war Japan actually fought. She had a sister ship named Musashi, built at Mitsubishi's Nagasaki shipyard under equally strict secrecy. Musashi was commissioned on August 5, 1942. She would be sunk on October 24, 1944 during the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea. She absorbed approximately 17 bombs and 19 torpedoes over 8 hours of relentless American air attacks, before finally going under with more than 1,000 of her crew. Despite her overwhelming firepower and impressive specifications, Yamato spent most of the war at anchor, accomplishing almost nothing. She became flagship of Admiral Yamamoto's combined fleet in February 1942 and served as his floating headquarters during the Battle of Midway in June of that year. But the main body remained 600 miles behind the carrier striking force and never engaged the enemy. The battle was decided by aircraft before Yamamoto could bring his battleships into action. From August 1942 through May 1943, Yamato sat idle at Truk Lagoon in the Central Pacific. Fuel shortages, the lack of adequate shore bombardment, ammunition types, and concerns about her relatively slower speed compared to the Congo-class battleships kept her sidelined while the war raged across the Pacific. Sailors, serving on less comfortable vessels, who endured cramped quarters and limited provisions while Yamato's crew enjoyed spacious accommodations and excellent food, gave her the sardonic nickname Hotel Yamato. The mockery reflected genuine frustration among the fleet that the Navy's greatest asset sat unused while other ships fought and died. Her only surface engagement against enemy warships came at the Battle off Samar on October 25, 1944. That day she fired her massive 18.1-inch main guns at enemy vessels for the first and only time in her entire career. She expended 104 main gun shells against the escort carriers and destroyers of the American force designated Taffy 3. But Vice Admiral Kurita, believing he faced a powerful fleet carrier group rather than expendable escort vessels, ordered withdrawal before destroying the vulnerable American ships. On that same day, her sister Musashi was being pounded to destruction in the Sibuyan Sea by American carrier aircraft. By April 1945, the strategic situation had become utterly desperate for Japan. The home islands faced starvation as American submarines strangled the sea lanes, bringing food and raw materials from Southeast Asia and China. Japanese cities burned under relentless firebombing that killed tens of thousands of civilians. Tokyo had been devastated in the Great Fire Raid of March 10th that killed more than 80,000 people in a single night. American forces invaded Okinawa on April 1st, with over 182,000 troops in the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War. The invasion fleet comprised the most powerful naval force ever assembled in human history. 11 fleet carriers, 6 light carriers, 22 escort carriers, 8 fast battleships, and hundreds of cruisers, destroyers, and support vessels protected the landing force. On Okinawa itself, approximately 68,000 Japanese troops prepared to fight from fortified positions in what would become one of the bloodiest battles of the entire Pacific campaign, lasting until late June, and killing more than 12,000 Americans and over 100,000 Japanese military and civilian dead. In late March, as Japanese military leaders briefed Emperor Hirohito on the army's extensive kamikaze plans for defending Okinawa, the emperor reportedly asked a devastating question. He wanted to know what the Navy was doing to assist in the defense. He asked if Japan had no more ships remaining to fight. The Naval General Staff interpreted this imperial inquiry as a stinging criticism that demanded immediate and dramatic action. The emperor clearly expected the Navy to contribute something to the defense of Okinawa, regardless of the cost. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, drafted a response to satisfy the imperial expectation. The plan he developed called for Yamato, accompanied by light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers, to sail toward Okinawa on what everyone understood would be a one-way mission. The force was designated the Surface Special Attack Force. In the Imperial Japanese Navy, the term special attack universally and unambiguously meant suicide operations. The mission called for Yamato to beach herself deliberately on Okinawa's southwestern shore and use her massive 18-inch guns as a coastal battery until all ammunition was expended. The surviving crew would then abandon the grounded hull and fight as ground troops alongside the army garrison until all were killed. The plan was strategic madness from any rational military perspective. Yamato would have to transit more than 300 miles of ocean absolutely swarming with American submarines that had been tracking Japanese movements for years. She would pass within easy striking range of more than a dozen American aircraft carriers carrying hundreds of combat aircraft. She would face overwhelming enemy air power with no air cover of her own, because the Japanese Navy had almost no operational aircraft remaining. Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito, commander of the Second Fleet and the officer who would have to lead this mission, flatly refused the orders when they were first presented. Born on July 26, 1890, in Fukuoka Prefecture, Ito had risen through the ranks over a distinguished career spanning more than 3 decades. Like Admiral Yamamoto before him, Ito had advocated for good relations with the United States and clearly understood the devastating industrial disparity between the two nations. He knew the mission was suicide without any meaningful military purpose. On April 5th, Vice Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka flew personally to Tokuyama to deliver the mission directive and overcome resistance from the fleet officers. When the ship captains were briefed together aboard Yahagi, they unanimously rejected the plan in what became one of the most remarkable confrontations in Imperial Japanese Navy history. The officers gathered in Yahagi's cramped wardroom erupted in angry protest. Captain Tameichi Hara of Yahagi compared the mission to throwing an egg against a rock. Captain Atsushi Oi of Grand Escort Command was even more direct. He demanded to know why the supposed honor of the surface fleet should be considered more important than the lives of thousands of trained sailors. He called the planners fools. Kusaka responded with 3 arguments designed to overcome their resistance. First, he argued that the sortie would divert American combat air patrols northward, giving the Army's kamikaze pilots a better chance of reaching the invasion fleet around Okinawa. Even if Yamato was sunk, her sacrifice might allow dozens of suicide aircraft to reach their targets. Second, the Emperor himself clearly expected maximum effort from all services, and the Navy must visibly demonstrate its commitment to the defense of the homeland. The Emperor's question about remaining ships had been interpreted as a direct criticism of naval inaction. Third, and most crucially, the whole nation would despise the Navy forever if the war ended with Yamato still intact, while the Army sacrificed thousands of young men in kamikaze attacks daily. How could the Navy explain to the Japanese people that their greatest warship had been preserved while soldiers and pilots died by the thousands? The argument about national shame and the expectations of the Emperor proved decisive. After hours of anguished debate, Admiral Ito finally relented. He reportedly told his officers that he believed they were being given an appropriate chance to die. A samurai, he observed, lives in such a way that he is always prepared to die. He added that if they were to die, they should die gloriously. The other officers reluctantly followed his lead. They would sail, knowing they would never return. That night, many officers wrote final letters to their families. Some burned personal effects they did not want to fall into enemy hands. Others simply sat quietly, contemplating the mission ahead. Official orders specified only enough fuel for a one-way trip to Okinawa. In a small act of secret defiance against the senselessness of the mission, personnel at the Tokuyama fuel depot loaded Yamato with nearly all the remaining fuel in the entire port, approximately 3,400 tons, far more than their orders authorized, but still probably not enough to return from Okinawa, even if the ship somehow survived. The Surface Special Attack Force comprised 10 warships under Vice Admiral Ito. Yamato herself was commanded by Rear Admiral Kosaku Aruga, a decorated officer who had assumed command on November 25, 1944. Light cruiser Yahagi was commanded by Captain Tameichi Hara, an experienced destroyer squadron leader who would survive to write one of the definitive accounts of Japanese naval operations. 8 destroyers completed the formation: Isokaze, Hamakaze, Yukikaze, Asashimo, Kasumi, Hatsushimo, Fuyutsuki, and Suzutsuki. Total personnel embarked across all 10 ships numbered approximately 7,000 officers and men. Yamato alone carried approximately 3,300, her complement swollen beyond normal levels by staff officers and additional crew. Her magazines held 1,170 rounds of 18.1-inch main battery ammunition and 11.5 million rounds of 25mm anti-aircraft ammunition. The ship was fully armed and ready to fight, but she would never reach her destination. The force departed Tokuyama between 1520 and 1600 hours on April 6, 1945, proceeding through the Bungo Strait at 12 knots in standard column formation. Yahagi led the column, followed by the 8 destroyers, with Yamato bringing up the rear. The weather was clear enough for departure. Officers and crew aboard each ship understood what lay ahead. Some wrote final letters to families. Others simply watched the Japanese coastline fade slowly behind them into the gathering dusk. Many had already said their farewells to loved ones who knew they would never see them again. Aboard Yamato, the crew had been given special rations for what would be their final meals. Sake was distributed to those who wanted it. Some men gathered in small groups to share memories of home. Others prayed at the small Shinto shrine maintained aboard the ship. The atmosphere was somber but not chaotic. These were professional sailors who understood their duty even when that duty demanded their lives. The ship's band played traditional songs as they cleared the harbour, a final gesture of defiance against the fate they all knew awaited them. After clearing the Bungo Strait and entering open ocean, the force reformed into a defensive disposition and resumed zigzagging at approximately 22 knots, heading southwest along the coast of Kyushu. The night was dark, the sea was relatively calm, and American submarines were watching every movement. At approximately 1745, the American submarine Threadfin detected the Japanese force by radar. Threadfin was part of a 3-submarine patrol group stationed specifically at Bungo Strait to detect any major Japanese surface sorties. Her orders were to report and shadow, not to attack. A submarine torpedo attack against a heavily escorted force of this size would be nearly suicidal and would likely result in only minimal damage to the enemy at the cost of revealing the submarine's position. At 21:44, she transmitted a detailed contact report with accurate force disposition, ship types, estimated speed, course, and formation arrangement. The message was sent in clear language because speed of transmission mattered far more than maintaining radio security. The American High Command needed this information immediately. Yamato's own radio operators intercepted the transmission and recognized exactly what it meant. The report included the exact composition of their force, their course, and their speed. A Japanese officer later recalled that hearing the American submarine openly reporting their position did nothing to improve the already grim morale among the senior officers. They now knew with certainty that the Americans were tracking them and would have ample time to prepare a devastating reception. The submarine Hackleback relieved Threadfin and took over close surveillance around 1900 hours, transmitting 4 additional contact reports through the night as the Japanese force transited southwest along the Kyushu coast. Japanese destroyers peeled off 3 separate times to depth charge and drive the shadow away, but each time had to abandon the hunt and race to catch up with Yamato. The Americans maintained continuous contact throughout the darkness. By dawn on April 7th, the force had passed the Osumi Peninsula and entered open water southwest of Kyushu, shifting to a defensive ring formation centered on Yamato. Speed was maintained at 20 knots. The weather had deteriorated overnight, with approximately 80% cloud cover at roughly 3,000 feet altitude and surface visibility reduced to 5 to 8 miles. Light rain fell in intermittent curtains across the Grey Sea. At 0657, destroyer Asashimo reported serious engine trouble and began falling behind the formation, unable to maintain fleet speed. She would never rejoin the main formation. At 0823, a Hellcat fighter from the carrier Essex sighted the Japanese force and transmitted an immediate contact report. By 0840, 7 Hellcats were circling overhead, observing and continuously updating their reports. 2 large Mariner flying boats from Patrol Squadron 21 began shadowing from inside the cloud cover around 10:14. Yamato attempted to drive off the flying boats by firing her 18.1-inch main guns using Sanshiki Beehive incendiary anti-aircraft shells. These special ammunition rounds were designed to burst at altitude and release thousands of small incendiary pellets intended to destroy aircraft. The rounds proved completely ineffective against the distant maneuvering aircraft. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher commanded Task Force 58 from the carrier Bunker Hill. This was the most powerful naval striking force in human history. When submarine contact reports arrived the night of April 6th, Admiral Raymond Spruance initially directed that the Yamato force should be handled by Rear Admiral Morton Deo's Surface Bombardment Group. 6 old battleships from the Okinawa Shore Bombardment Force, veterans of Pearl Harbor that had been raised, rebuilt, and modernized, could potentially be reinforced by 6 modern fast battleships from Task Force 58. Combined, this surface force would bring 54 16-inch guns against Yamato's 9 18-inch guns. It would have been history's last battleship versus battleship engagement. Mitcher had entirely different ideas. The carrier admiral recognized this as the opportunity to prove once and for all that carrier-based air power had made the battleship obsolete as a naval weapon. At approximately 1000 hours on April 7th, Mitcher gave the order to launch a massive coordinated airstrike against the Yamato force. He deliberately did not inform Spruance until after the aircraft were already airborne and forming up for their attack runs. Spruance acquiesced. Deo, forming what would have been the last battle line in naval history, received word and messaged headquarters with barely concealed disappointment, wondering if the aircraft had left anything for his guns. 3 separate task groups participated in the attack on Yamato. The first strike wave comprised 280 aircraft in total. This included 132 fighters, both Hellcats and Corsairs combined, 50 Helldiver dive bombers, and 98 Avenger torpedo bombers. Hancock's group of 53 aircraft launched late and became separated in the poor weather, reducing the effective first wave to approximately 227 aircraft. A subsequent wave from Task Group 58.4 launched approximately 110 additional aircraft. Total aircraft committed throughout the engagement reached approximately 386 individual sorties. American pilots had been carefully briefed before launch on specific tactics derived from hard lessons learned during the sinking of Musashi the previous October. Musashi had survived far longer than expected because torpedo hits were distributed relatively evenly across both sides of her hull, allowing damage control parties to counter-flood effectively and maintain stability. The tactical approach for Yamato would be deliberately different. Pilots were specifically instructed to concentrate torpedo attacks on the port side to induce asymmetric flooding that counterflooding could never correct, causing the ship to capsize rapidly. At 12:32, Yamato lookouts sighted the incoming strike, a massive swarm of aircraft emerging simultaneously from the clouds in all directions. At 12:34, her 2 forward main battery turrets elevated and fired Sanshiki Beehive shells at the approaching aircraft. The rounds failed to bring down a single plane. Fighters went in first, screaming down through the cloud base at maximum speed, strafing and rocketing the anti-aircraft positions to suppress defensive fire. 14 Corsairs from Bunker Hill saturated Yamato with rockets that caused little structural damage to the heavily armored hull but proved deadly to the exposed gunners manning the open anti-aircraft platforms. Dive bombers attacked simultaneously from altitude, plunging through the cloud base to release their armor-piercing bombs. Avenger torpedo bombers came in low from multiple directions, making coordinated runs against the desperately maneuvering battleship. At approximately 12:40, two 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs struck the ship in quick succession. The first bomb penetrated the weather deck and exploded deep inside crew quarters, killing dozens of men instantly in the confined spaces. The second struck further aft, destroying the secondary gun director, knocking out one of the two air search radars, and starting an uncontrollable fire in the superstructure. The spreading flames killed all but one crewman in the aft 155mm turret, silencing that weapon for the remainder of the battle. At 12:45, the first torpedo slammed into Yamato's port bow, tearing open the hull below the waterline and shipping approximately 2,200 tons of seawater into flooded compartments. Within minutes, two more torpedoes struck the port side near the engine room and boiler room. Yamato immediately began listing 5 to 6 degrees to port as water flooded uncontrollably into her damaged sections. Damage control parties initiated counter-flooding procedures, pumping seawater deliberately into starboard voids to level the ship. The counter-flooding worked initially, reducing the dangerous list to approximately 1 degree. During this same attack wave, destroyer Hamikaze was struck by a torpedo that blew her completely in half amidships. Light cruiser Yahagi absorbed a torpedo hit in her engine room that knocked out all propulsion. She went dead in the water, unable to maneuver, transformed instantly into a stationary target. Destroyer Suzutsuki had her entire bow blown completely off by a torpedo but somehow remained afloat. A second wave of roughly 50 aircraft from Essex and Bataan attacked around 1300 hours. 3 or 4 additional torpedoes struck the port side in rapid succession, with one finally hitting the starboard side. Yamato's list increased alarmingly to between 15 and 18 degrees to port as thousands more tons of seawater flooded into her hull. Counter-flooding of all remaining starboard void spaces reduced this to approximately 10 degrees, but the ship had now exhausted virtually all available counter-flooding capacity in compartments that could be flooded without compromising propulsion. Speed had already fallen to approximately 18 knots. A third wave of 110 aircraft from Task Group 58.4 arrived around 13:33. 20 Avenger torpedo bombers made carefully coordinated torpedo runs, attacking deliberately and exclusively from the port side exactly as briefed. 3 torpedoes struck home in quick succession, adding roughly 3,000 additional tons of seawater and causing a further 7 degrees of list. In desperation, damage control parties made the terrible decision to counterflood both the starboard engine and boiler rooms. This would sacrifice all remaining propulsion capability, but might save the ship from capsizing completely. The counterflooding drowned several hundred crewmen trapped in those compartments with no warning and no chance to escape. The flooding temporarily stabilized the list, but reduced speed to approximately 10 knots. Additional torpedo hits targeted the stern area, jamming the rudder mechanism and locking the ship into a continuous, uncontrolled turn to starboard. By 13:45, Executive Officer Nomura reported grimly to Captain Aruga that every single damage control officer was now dead. Counter-flooding procedures could no longer correct the worsening list. The ship was doomed and nothing could save her. At 1400 hours, Admiral Ito ordered the mission formally cancelled via flag hoist signal because all radio equipment had been destroyed. At 14:02, Captain Aruga gave the order to abandon ship. Men began streaming onto the steeply listing deck, trying desperately to escape before the ship went under. Yahagi had continued absorbing devastating punishment throughout the prolonged battle. She absorbed 12 bombs and 7 torpedoes in total, before finally capsizing at 14:05, just minutes after Yamato's abandoned ship order. 446 of her approximately 1,000 crew died as she rolled over and slipped beneath the waves. Yamato continued absorbing hits even as her surviving crew scrambled to escape the doomed vessel. By 14:17, the 8th and 9th torpedoes struck home. The now uncorrectable list passed 15 degrees to port, far beyond any possibility of recovery. Alarms sounded warnings of critical temperatures in the forward main battery magazines as fires spread uncontrollably through the ship, but no working pumps remained functional to flood those magazines before detonation. As the starboard side rose progressively higher out of the water due to the extreme port list, the previously protected underwater portion of the starboard hull became exposed. 6 Avengers from Yorktown immediately recognized the opportunity and attacked from the starboard side with torpedoes deliberately reset for shallow 20-foot running depth, striking the exposed hull below what had been the armored waterline. At approximately 14:20, Yamato's main deck went completely vertical as the ship rolled onto her beam ends. Men who had been trying to escape slid helplessly down the nearly vertical deck into the churning sea. Some clung desperately to any handhold they could find. Others jumped clear, trying to swim away from the massive hull before it came down on top of them. The ship's great propellers, some still turning slowly from residual momentum, posed a deadly hazard to anyone in the water nearby. She rolled completely over to port, exposing her red-painted bottom to the sky for one terrible moment. At approximately 14:23, the number 1 forward magazine detonated catastrophically. Fires had finally reached the stored ammunition and propellant charges, igniting thousands of tons of high explosives simultaneously. The resulting explosion sent a pillar of fire 2,000 meters into the sky. The mushroom cloud reached approximately 6,000 meters altitude, clearly visible and distinctly audible 200 kilometers away in Kagoshima. American pilots orbiting overhead reported feeling the shockwave even at several thousand feet altitude. Some aircraft were reportedly knocked temporarily off course by the blast. The ship broke completely apart at the explosion point. The bow section, still inverted, separated entirely from the stern. Both massive sections sank rapidly to the seafloor 340 meters below, carrying with them the bodies of thousands of men who had not escaped in time. Total battle duration from first attack to final catastrophic explosion measured approximately 1 hour and 46 minutes. Yamato absorbed at least 11 torpedoes and possibly as many as 13. Approximately 7 to 10 struck the port side, with only 1 to 3 hitting starboard. The deliberate concentration on one side was confirmed as intentional American tactics. At least 6 to 8 confirmed bomb hits struck the ship, with some estimates suggesting as many as 15 when including near misses. Of the approximately 3,300 crew aboard Yamato, more than 3,000 were killed, a mortality rate exceeding 91%. Only between 269 and 280 men survived, pulled from the cold water by destroyers Yukikaze, Fuyutsuki, and Hatsushimo. Many who initially survived the capsizing were killed moments later by the massive magazine explosion. Destroyer Asashimo, separated earlier by her mechanical troubles, was located and attacked by American aircraft. She was sunk with all hands. Approximately 330 men died with no survivors at all. Hamikaze lost 100 killed when the torpedo blew her in half. Isokaze and Kasumi were both so badly damaged they had to be scuttled by their own escorting vessels. Suzutsuki, her entire bow torn away, and 57 crew dead, somehow managed to make it all the way back to Sasebo, steaming in reverse for the entire journey. Total Japanese killed across all ships reached approximately 4,000 to 4,200 officers and men. American losses amounted to 10 aircraft and 12 air crewmen killed. Against approximately 4,000 Japanese dead, this represents a kill ratio of roughly 350 to 1, confirming Captain Hara's bitter assessment of throwing an egg against a rock. Vice Admiral Ito died as he intended, going down with Yamato after ordering the mission cancelled and bidding farewell to his officers. He was posthumously promoted to full admiral. His only son died just 10 days later on April 17th, while participating in a kamikaze attack near Okinawa. Father and son perished within days of each other in separate suicide missions. Captain Aruga commanded from the exposed bridge throughout the entire battle, refusing to take cover even as bombs and torpedoes tore his ship apart around him. When the abandoned ship order was given, he personally ordered young Ensign Mitsuru Yoshida off the bridge, saving his life. Aruga then lashed himself to the binnacle, the ship's compass stand, with rope to ensure he would go down with his vessel. He was posthumously promoted 2 steps to Vice Admiral. Ensign Yoshida escaped through a porthole as Yamato capsized. He jumped into the turbulent water, was immediately pulled under by powerful suction from the sinking hull, and was then violently blasted back to the surface by the force of the magazine explosion. Rescued by Fuyutsuki, he later completed a memoir titled Requiem for Battleship Yamato in 1946. American occupation authorities suppressed the work for years as an example of Japanese militaristic spirit. Finally, published in 1952, The book became recognized as one of the masterpieces of Japanese war literature. Survivor Naoyoshi Ishida recalled in later interviews that his first son had been born just weeks before departure on March 12th. He held his newborn child for only one night before leaving for the mission. As he departed that morning, he knew with complete certainty he would never return. After his wife saw him off at the door, he waited until she went back inside. Then he walked slowly around his house one final time, looking at everything, careful to stay where she could not see him. He tried repeatedly to write a farewell letter telling her she could remarry and asking her to raise their son to be a good man. But he tore up every attempt, unable to send something that would make her weep. Below decks during the battle, Ishida witnessed scenes that haunted him for the rest of his life. He described the wounded begging desperately for water, the injured bleeding out on the steel deck plates, the men crying out for help that could not come. The damage control parties had to place wounded men in compartments for treatment. Then, to prevent flooding from spreading throughout the ship, they had to seal the watertight doors on those same compartments. They could hear the men trapped inside calling out as the water rose around them. In the water after abandoning ship, Ishida watched American fighters strafe survivors floating helplessly in the sea. Everyone capable of movement had to dive underwater to escape the machine gun fire. Ishida survived by clinging to floating debris in the cold April sea, sustained only by thoughts of his newborn son waiting at home. He reflected decades later that if survivors had known rescue ships were actually coming, many more men might have held on rather than giving up hope. Kazuhiro Fukumoto was a young enlisted sailor who had genuinely believed Yamato was completely unsinkable. The night before departure, the brutal hazing that junior sailors routinely endured suddenly and unexpectedly stopped. The senior petty officers showed unexpected kindness to the younger men, treating them almost gently, as if acknowledging they would all die together soon. During the battle, Fukumoto waited in complete darkness below decks. Just as his team sealed one compartment hatch, a torpedo struck nearby with tremendous force. At that instant, every man on the lowest deck drowned instantly as seawater flooded in. Water came surging up from below with terrifying speed. Inside the damaged ship, there were no lights. Everything became confusion and terror in the darkness. Fukumoto escaped through a hatch, blown open by internal air pressure, was drawn violently into the whirlpool created by a still-turning propeller, lost consciousness completely, and eventually surfaced some distance from the capsizing ship. He opened his eyes and saw blue sky above him. Rescued roughly 4 hours later by Yukikaze, survivors were slapped hard across both cheeks at the top of the rescue ladder. This was not cruelty. It was necessary to keep utterly exhausted men from losing consciousness and falling back into the sea they had just escaped. Operation Ten-Go was coordinated with Kikusui No. 1, the first mass kamikaze assault against the American fleet off Okinawa. On the same day, Yamato departed from Tokuyama. 391 Navy and 133 Army aircraft attacked the invasion fleet. Nearly 300 of these aircraft were flown by kamikaze pilots on deliberate suicide missions. They succeeded in sinking 3 American destroyers and damaging dozens of other vessels. The sacrifice of Yamato was designed to support the even larger sacrifice of the kamikaze corps. By April 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy had been functionally destroyed as an effective fighting force. Carrier aviation had been eliminated at the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf, where Japan lost the vast majority of its trained naval aviators in what American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Most major surface combatants had been sunk over the preceding years in battles from Midway to Leyte Gulf. Fuel reserves were nearly exhausted because American submarines had systematically destroyed the tanker fleet that once brought oil from the Dutch East Indies. What fuel remained was hoarded for kamikaze operations and the expected final defense of the home islands. Rear Admiral Toshitane Takata acknowledged after the war that the Yamato sortie represented the absolute last possible operation they could have mounted. From the viewpoint of remaining fuel, trained personnel, and operational warships, there was literally nothing else the surface fleet could contribute. It was genuinely their final effort as a navy. Some officers privately believed the mission was ordered simply because doing nothing was considered more shameful than dying uselessly. After Yamato's destruction, Navy Minister Yonai informed the Emperor of the stark truth. There was no fleet remaining. The Imperial Japanese Navy had simply ceased to exist as a combat-capable force. Japan's once mighty fleet which had struck Pearl Harbor and conquered an empire stretching from Burma to Wake Island, had been reduced to a handful of damaged ships hiding in harbors under camouflage nets. The sinking of Yamato represented a verdict delivered by history with brutal finality. It demonstrated conclusively that carrier-based air power had made the battleship obsolete as a naval weapon. Admiral Deo's battle line, the last ever formed against an enemy fleet, arrived in the area to find nothing left to engage. The age of the battleship ended not with a climactic duel between armored giants, but with swarms of small aircraft, methodically destroying the greatest warship Japan had ever built. Yamato's wreck lies at approximately 30 degrees 22 minutes north latitude, 128 degrees, 4 minutes east longitude. The site is roughly 290 kilometers southwest of Kyushu, at a depth of 340 meters. Initial sonar contact with the wreck was made in 1982. Photographic confirmation came in 1984 and was verified by one of Yamato's original designers, Shigeru Makino, who recognized distinctive features of his creation. A definitive underwater survey using the research submersible Pisces II occurred on August 1, 1985. Additional detailed surveys in 1999 and 2016 produced comprehensive footage documenting the condition and position of the wreck. The ship lies in two main separated sections on the seafloor. The bow section of approximately 80 to 90 meters rests on its side. The stern and midships section of approximately 170 meters lies completely inverted nearby. The massive gun turrets, which were held in their barbettes purely by gravity rather than mechanical fasteners, fell out entirely during the capsizing and now rest separately on the ocean floor. The extensive debris field scattered between the bow and stern sections provides mute testimony to the catastrophic violence of the magazine explosion that tore the ship apart. The Kure Maritime Museum, known popularly as the Yamato Museum, opened on April 23, 2005, at the precise location where Yamato was originally constructed. The museum houses a 26.3-meter detailed scale model built at 1:10 proportion, along with authentic shell casings, artifacts recovered from the construction site during post-war development, and the massive precision lathe used to machine her gun barrels. On Tokunoshima Island, the closest inhabited land to the actual wreck site, a memorial tower was erected in 1968. Annual commemorations gather survivors and family members every April 7th at Kure's Nagasako Park to honor those who perished. The deeper significance of Operation Ten-Go lies beyond military history. The mission was conceived not to achieve any realistic military objective. No credible strategist believed Yamato could reach Okinawa, much less influence the battle there. Instead, the operation was designed to satisfy a political and cultural imperative that defied rational analysis. The nation's supreme naval symbol must not survive the war unused. Japan's greatest weapon must be sacrificed to demonstrate fighting spirit, even when fighting could change nothing. Thousands of sailors died for a gesture that altered nothing. The survivors carried that knowledge for the rest of their lives. Kazuhiro Fukumoto, interviewed decades after the battle, confessed that inside his heart he often asked why he survived when so many others died. The answer he eventually found provided some measure of peace. He believed something kept him alive so he could properly mourn the dead and care for their families. His survival meant their sacrifice would not be forgotten. The 3,000 men who died aboard Yamato on April 7, 1945, did not choose their fate. They followed orders issued by commanders who privately acknowledged the mission offered no realistic chance of success. They died not because their deaths could meaningfully alter the outcome of a war already lost, but because their leaders believed dying was preferable to the shame of survival. The ship named after Japan itself became, in death, a mirror for Japan. Her destruction reflected the cost of fanaticism, the tragedy of talent and courage wasted on impossible missions ordered by men who valued symbolic gesture over human life, and the enduring need of survivors to find meaning in what can never be made sensible. Ensign Yoshida's closing words in his Requiem point towards such meaning. "Make of this moment," he wrote, "a turning point toward a life of constancy and dedication. The dead cannot be brought back, but their story can be told." The waters above the wreck are calm now. The battle ended 8 decades ago, but the story endures because it speaks to something larger than one ship or one engagement. It speaks to the cost of human conflict and the terrible price paid by those who follow orders into the void. The mightiest battleship ever constructed was destroyed in 106 minutes. 4,000 men died. 10 American aircraft were lost. Naval warfare had changed forever, decided not by thunder from 16-inch guns, but by the drone of aircraft engines and the crash of torpedoes. That is what Yamato's sacrifice revealed, and that is why, 80 years after she slipped beneath the waves, we still remember the men who sailed southwest, knowing they would never return.